Hello, everyone. On behalf of our team at Starkloff Disability Institute, I want to warmly welcome you to today's webinar titled Universal Design for the Groups Left Behind. My name is Rachel Goldmeyer, and I'm going to be one of your hosts for today. I also happen to be Starkloff Disability Institute's Universal Design Program Coordinator. For a brief physical description of myself, I'm a white millennial woman with dark brown curly hair and glasses, and I am wearing a dark shirt with a colorful flower on it. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Starkloff Disability Institute, we are a disability-led nonprofit in St. Louis, Missouri, and we believe in building inclusion where we live, learn, work, and play, and we do so through our educational and candidate-facing programs. We are thrilled to be joined by an absolutely amazing lineup of experts. Our speakers today include Allison Brewer, Gia Wilson, Kevin Symons, and Asia Black. Throughout the session, you'll hear examples, insights, and strategies that can inform your work, whether you're a designer, educator, student, or an advocate. Thank you for taking the time to join us from wherever you are in the world. We're so excited to have such a passionate and engaged audience gathered virtually here today, and we're going to be exploring the importance of designing for a wide variety of groups that are often forgotten about and underrepresented in the design world. Before we dive in, we just have some quick housekeeping. This session is being recorded. We'll be sharing the link to that recording once we're able to have the captions professionally cleaned. Today's event is made up of a presentation, and that presentation will be followed by a question-answer session. So please be sure to drop your questions in the question-answer box as we go along so we can pick out some to ask to our expert panel. We do also have a satisfaction survey for this webinar, and it is our hope that everyone in attendance will take a few minutes to fill it out once our event has concluded. We will be dropping the link for the form right now, just in case anyone needs to leave early. Thank you so much again for being here. Your presence is so important, and we hope you leave today not only more informed, but ready to create change in your work, your community, and beyond. Now, I'd like to take a moment to begin our program with a thought-provoking presentation led by Allison Brewer. I'm going to go ahead and pass the microphone to Allison at this time. Take it away, Allison.
Hello, everyone. I am just pulling up my presentation for you all right now. Welcome. I am so excited to be here. For a visual description of myself, I am a white, queer presenting millennial person. I am in front of a blue and a green wall with a picture of a St. Louis abandoned building behind me, covered in graffiti, wearing a blue blazer and a white shirt with a copper bronze colored octopus necklace and glasses. The screen is titled, it's got a title of the presentation, Embedding Equity Through Universal Design, and a kind of a collage approach with the picture of a world, a sunburst, a hand, and some construction paper cutouts. I do also have on the title page the Starkloff Disability Institute and today's date, June 17th, 2026. I'd like to introduce myself. If I do not have a screen that prompts, then I just completely forget. My name is Allison Brewer. I use they, them pronouns. I am the special assistant for data initiatives at St. Louis University in the Office of the President, and I am the founder of Voices Agency. The screen is a white background with a picture of myself, again, a queer presenting white millennial person with glasses. I am openly queer, non-binary, and I am autistic, and I have narcolepsy with cataplexy. And I always do a little bit of education about my disabilities in general because they are very misunderstood and heavily underdiagnosed. The way that I explain narcolepsy is basically my brain thinks that I have been awake for 48 to 72 hours at any given or at every moment, no matter if I get 10 hours of sleep or 2 hours of sleep in a night. Um, Cataplexy is uh, a rare, also a rare, it's narcolepsy and cataplexy are rare diseases. Cataplexy is when there is a chemical that is released in my brain that leads to partial or full body paralysis. And the only trigger is strong feelings. So then I usually follow that up with, have you had a strong feeling today? Um, Laughed at a joke, gotten angry at, I don't know, anything that's happening in the world right now, upset, afraid. Um, the most common trigger for cataplexy is actually laughter. So I also have to warn people, if you're going to be funny, let me know so I can sit down. I think I am hilarious, so I'm the person that laughs the most at my jokes. I started my career undiagnosed as a special educator. And so my background actually was very much fueled by universal design in the classroom. Um, Before the age of 40, though, and I just turned 40 literally like last week, um, I've had to file two disability discrimination complaints. One I did with attorneys and one I did on my own. I founded Voice is Agency to address the lack of civil rights and protections for children with disabilities and their families in K-12 environments. This has led to me attending or leading over 2,000 IEPs and 504 related meetings across 200 schools, 90 districts, and 10 states. The most important thing to know about me is if I were an X-Men character, I would be Mystique. And if you know about X-Men or superheroes, that is very intentional. I am Team Magneto because I am here for liberation over assimilation. And that kind of speaks to my ethos, if you will. This is actually an example of component of universal design that I always include is an agenda, a flow, and starting with goals. And so we started with the opening and introductions. We're going to dive into universal design versus the ADA, universal design across environments. I'll have a closing charge to you, and then we'll jump right into our panel. And I'm so excited to be sharing space with such amazing panelists. I hope that at the end of this short presentation, this introductory presentation, you will have an increased understanding of multicultural and disability diverse experiences, barriers, and opportunities for success across built environments. And even if you, and especially if you identify as disabled like I do, I don't know what I don't know. And we are only one representation of our disability. And that looks different across race, across gender, across religion, across any number of our identities. I hope that you walk away with increased access to tangible tools and resources that support the access and success of those impacted by design systems. And I hope that you have an increased ability to disrupt systems of oppression across built environments through the application of universal design. Okay, jumping into context, and this is setting the tone for why we even need universal design in the first place. And this is a white slide with and I will read the words out on the slide. It's got a picture of a hand that is pointing to a quote at the bottom of the slide. So inequity is by design. Understanding how our systems were originally designed to function helps deepen our awareness of where we need to go. I like to, uh, another way I like to say that is we cannot change what we do not name. It is critically important for us to be able to name what needs to change in order for us to be successful and thrive across built environments. Our path towards equity cannot occur in silos and must center those who are most impacted by inequities. This presentation reflects my lived experiences across identities, in addition to the experiences I've navigated while in solidarity across communities that I may or may not belong. I will never speak for anyone other than myself, but I will also uplift what we know to be true, that is especially reflective of how oppressive systems were designed to begin with. And I like to start with this quote by Dr. Bettina Love. We want to do more than survive. Abolitionist teaching in the pursuit of educational freedom is where this quote comes from. Abolitionist, sorry, abolitionist teaching is not just about tearing down and building up, but also about the joy necessary to be in solidarity with others, knowing that your struggle for freedom is constant, but that there is beauty in the camaraderie of creating a just world. And I start there because disability can be one of the most isolating experiences that we have, and that is by design and also something that we can combat through design. We can redesign these systems. Um, with my background in special education, it did not take long for me to realize that our education system was not built for everyone. And it wasn't built for all students to succeed. It wasn't built for all teachers to be able to teach. And as I was coming to terms with my failing health, I didn't know what was going on, and it took me over a decade to get diagnosed with narcolepsy, which is the national average, by the way. Um, there was only so much that I felt that I could do working within a system that was actively uh, working against the students that I was here to serve. And so that's what led to my founding of Voices Agency, serving families, navigating barriers in schools. And here, here's exactly where the first time I really truly applied universal design, not for teaching and not for built spaces, but for systems. And this system was, how do families engage with schools? And what do families need in order to show up for their children and advocate and access a free and appropriate public education, which is guaranteed under law? What we find is that our guarantees aren't guaranteed at all, and that we have to often fight and or advocate in order to get those. And so for me, it was about, how do we build systems for those who are the furthest away from equity? And that meant building tools with folks who were directly impacted based on their needs and with the widest use possible. And that jumps into the principles of universal design. This is a slide with a white background. It has the 7 principles of universal design cut out in a pie chart that has a range of colors from red to blue and yellow. I will also read each principle out after I read the slide. So universal design centers those who are most, pardon me for the spelling error, most impacted by barriers to access, and has core features of that it is accessible, it is inclusive, and it is usable. Before I jump into the principles, I'm going to give you a perfect example of my aunt, who used to be a special ed teacher in Chicago for decades. And she was a kindergarten teacher, and they had this beautifully designed building, that just reminds me of kind of like 70s. We're going for vibes and we're going for classroom conversations and experiments and fun. And it's beautiful building. Her building or her classroom was in the basement that had a walkout to directly to the playground. But they couldn't use the when she had a student who was a wheelchair user, she they ended up renovating the ramp or the access hallway to go from the classroom to the playground. Spent time, money, got it all good to go. Very exciting. And come to find out, well, yes, this student can now get to the playground, but there was a lip and there was a curb with no curb cut and an incline that you would have to go up to be able to get to the playground itself. So it was basically like the student would be able to go look at the playground instead of use the playground. That did not meet universal design standards. Probably if the design team had engaged the family in the process, that would have been an issue right from the jump that would have been identified. So we start with principle number one, equitable use. Can every, does this maximize? Can everybody use this? If we've got a playground and we've got access to the playground, can everybody use that access? Flexibility in use. So if I'm going into a building and I was looking at I was giving a similar presentation to this at a design school. And I'm walking in, and again, this is a beautiful building, and these doors must have cost, I don't even know how much. Ridiculous, but they kind of open up their giant doors that I don't know, they don't even really work like a normal one. There's not really a handle. You have to press the button, but in order to get to the button and through the door, is this going to work for people who utilize wheelchairs, um, who also might have different kinds of mobility devices like canes or walkers or crutches or power chairs or manual chairs. It turns out that it's really hard to get from the access point through the doors itself. And you know that that costs so much money and it looks great and it's not really flexible in use. And this is at a design school. So now we go into principle three, simple and intuitive use. And I even just told you it was kind of confusing for me to figure out how does this door even work? If it's not intuitive, if it's not simple, is it functional? And if we're looking at public spaces, especially, is that even going to work? Principle number four, perceptible info. Again, this kind of goes, I mean, all of these things feed into each other, but was there a sign? What if this door didn't work? What were the alternatives? Principle 5, tolerance for error. Again, if I'm utilizing any kind of mobility aids, supports, anything like that, if I have any kind of service animal, having gigantic doors pressing on you as you're trying to get it, what is the tolerance for error and what is the level of harm that will come if that isn't if this use isn't actually able to be used? Low physical effort. And I'm just gonna go on doors because doors are so many access points into the world. We have to be able to get through doors, up to doors, and then through places to be able to even access basic societal functions like learning, like healthcare, like um, libraries. And so many of our doors, if the button doesn't work, well, we'll fix it when we fix it. How do we have feedback loops that alert our buildings when doors are not working? What is the effort that has to, what kind of effort does somebody who's directly impacted have to go through in order to make a change? Principle 7, size and space for approach and use. Again, if I'm maybe designing a school and I'm thinking about how am I going to ensure all children or all students who come through these doors are able to access what it is we're here to provide. And if we're not thinking about these things in concert and all together, are we designing for everyone? And that leads right into who we are leaving out. I also like these 7 principles. Universal design itself came out of the field of architecture. I am not an architect, and I am so sorry for the architects in the room. I do have a lot of noise to make about how our spaces, our built environments are designed or redesigned in order to serve our disability diverse community. And so I'm going to pick on my own field for a minute, education. And one of the how we translate the practice, our identity, our understanding of universal design is multiple modes of representation. So how am I representing the same information in different ways? Multiple modes of action and expression. So how am I giving options for our students to share how they have learned? And then multiple modes of engagement. So what are the ways that our students can engage with the material itself? And I like to say we start concrete before we move to visual and then abstract. So it's a foundational and education we have to build. And so often we go to the abstract and our students don't have the opportunity to engage. So that becomes a component of universal design. But what about the ADA? Oh, so this is again a slide with a white background and a black and white picture of Bradley Lomax, who is addressing the crowd on stage in his wheelchair alongside Judy Human, both disability justice warriors, and a lot of people don't know that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 hadn't gone enacted for years, and it took a nationwide protest, the 504 protests, to really hold Congress accountable for enacting Section 504. And it was in, um, oh my goodness, it was in California that the longest standing protest of any government building took place, and was and Bradley Lomax was a part of that, as were and he brought along the Black Panthers. And so when we talk about who's left behind, I like to also ask, who is this for? And if this isn't for everyone, then it isn't universal design. And so a common misconception is that the Americans with Disabilities Act is a function or a part of universal design, and it is not. The ADA was written into law in 1990, along the same time as universal design was being pioneered in North Carolina, I'm going to get the university wrong, so I won't say it, but by the field of architecture. Um, and the ADA was written into law in 1990 to federally mandate minimum accessibility requirements for people with disabilities in public settings. Major differences include the universal design is a design philosophy. It says, how do we design and who do we design with? And I would argue that if we aren't designing with those who are most impacted, then we really aren't going to be able to meet the universal design standards, because we're deciding for people without people. So universal design is a philosophy versus the ADA, which is a compliance mandate. Universal design can be applied absolutely anywhere and everywhere. I try to apply it when I'm inviting someone over to my house for dinner. Who has the most amount of allergies? That's we start with what can't we eat, and then we build from there. The ADA is only applicable to public settings. Universal design is about maximum usability versus the bare minimum, which is the ADA. Universal design is an abundance model. It says that everyone deserves and everyone has the right to participate in our society, and we're going to design that. We're going to design the outcomes that we want to see. And the ADA is more like a deficit model. What is the bare minimum that we need to put in place so that we can let these people in? And then we've got a grandfather. There isn't, what grandfather clause? Public services, how could they be, our services are looked at from a deficit model. What is it that we need just to function and not participate? And then finally, universal design is generative versus adversarial. We only can make changes with the ADA if we fight, if we file a complaint. By nature, it is adversarial versus universal design, which is how do we build together for access. I think we are getting close on time, and so I am gonna continue rapidly. Universal design across disciplines. Again, this is a white slide, and it's got a picture of multiracial, diverse people uh, and a home for elderly, also with children in the mix. So universal design is a tactic to increase a sense of belonging across environments and disrupt white supremacy culture. Hitler, back in the 1940s, said that the United States was able to legislate eugenics better than he could ever have dreamed. And eugenics, in case you don't know, is the active elimination of traits from a population. And this has been applied in our country, our very legislature, from guardianship to forced sterilization to incarceration. All of this is designed and therefore can be redesigned. Our society and culture was not built for all of us to thrive, but we have the opportunity to change that. Regardless of our discipline or field, we can all apply the power of design to our communities and our work. And I would argue our educators, our social workers, it is most important for us to understand universal design so that we build communities that can thrive from birth, from the cradle to the cap. And that's our graduation cap. Universal design can be a powerful tool to redesign neighborhoods, communities, cities, and civic functions. Don't get me started on voting, y'all. Communities that center universal design understand the importance across early childhood and elderly settings. And I would also argue that we have plenty of examples of Native and Indigenous cultures that have modeled this before there was language for this, what universal design looks like in practice at the community level. And that's why I have all of these pictures here of young people with our elderly, because universal design is lifelong. It's not just for one person. And quality of life extends from the cradle until our last day. We all deserve universal design until that happens. I will close with actually where we started, because in this struggle, in this fight for liberation, we can't just tear down and we can't just build up. Abolitionist teaching is not just about tearing down and building up, but also about the joy necessary to be in solidarity with others, knowing that your struggle for freedom is constant, but that there is beauty in the camaraderie of creating a just world. And my charge for you is, if you are building for someone, without someone, can you call it universal design? So my charge would be, anytime you're designing or redesigning a system, to do it with those who are most impacted. And we're getting ready to start our panel with all of our panelists to answer who that might be. And so I hope that this foundational overview, not a technical learning, but a foundational introduction overview, can be helpful as we start to think about who we've left behind in this design process. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Allison, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's Zoom webinar event, Universal Design for the Groups Left Behind. My name is Grace Diley, and I'm an intern here at Starkloff Disability Institute, and I'll be moderating today's panel. As a brief physical description of myself, I have blonde curly hair, and I'm wearing a white shirt. This free event was designed to look at how many groups are often underrepresented in the world of design and how we can better ensure representation moving forward. Following this webinar, we will have announcements related to this topic, so please stay tuned following the event today. So for some housekeeping for today's panel, I'll be asking our panelists some pre-prepared questions. After the panel is concluded, we should have some time to take a few questions from our audience as well. And throughout the panel, please feel free to drop question and answers in the box. For both this panel as well as the Q&A section, I ask that we listen to each other, give everyone an opportunity to speak one at a time, and be thoughtful and respectful even if we disagree. We also want to do our best to keep both our questions and answers concise to leave time for others to contribute as well. Additionally, as we take turns speaking, let us make sure to say something along the lines of Grace here or Grace speaking, so our audience knows who is talking and when. We are all here today because of our desire to learn more about representation in the world of design. So without further delay, we're going to turn to all our wonderful panelists. And the first question we have is, please share your name, organization, and our title with us, and tell us a little bit about the work that you do around universal design and or inclusion.
I will be first. Hello, everyone. My name is Symons. I am an architect with Mackey Mitchell Architects, and I am deaf. I've been with this firm for 17 years, starting in the St. Louis office for 11 years, and now in Dallas office for the past 6 years. I was originally hired to support project teams with our 3D BIM software. But after walking past a stack of blueprints for the Maryland School for the Deaf and Delaware School for the Deaf, I saw that and I sensed a calling, having grown up and graduated from the Illinois School for the Deaf myself. Over the years, I continued to support our project teams. Sorry, this is the interpreter. My screen has frozen.
This is the interpreter. Kevin is frozen for me as well.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. We are just waiting for Kevin's return. While we're waiting for Kevin's return, just because we don't know how long it's going to be, do we have another panelist who can start answering? And then when Kevin returns, we'll get him in very next opportunity.
Sure, I will go ahead and introduce myself. Hello, everyone. My name is Aja Black. For a brief description, I'm a Black American woman with Black hair. I'm wearing a pink shirt, and I also have on pink glasses. I am an occupational therapist by trade, but I currently work as an ergonomist with Human-Scale in their consulting division. Prior to joining Human-Scale, I was the ergonomics program manager at the USDA, where I evaluated and did assessments for the federal workforce to build workstations that work best for them. My ergonomics background, however, is a little non-traditional. I just don't focus on the physical aspect. I look at their cognitive abilities, their organizational abilities, psychosocial as well, to try to create the best inclusive workforce or environment for them to thrive.
Go next. My name is Gia Wilson. I'm a landscape designer and policy analyst for MIG. work at all scales. And so I've done a lot of work with not only designing accessible spaces, accessible parks, working primarily in play environments for children with disabilities, but I've also helped with plan reviews um, and policy development for accessibility for different cities around California and around the United States.
I'll just do a brief. Allison, you just heard from me. In my role at SLU, I am working on data and systems transformation. And so this is actually, I get to build the technical and change processes that are related to data initiatives at St. Louis University from the enterprise level. So design is a heavy part of my role.
Hello. I apologize for that. My internet was going fine for 40 minutes, and then all of a sudden I was kicked off of my laptop. I'm going to finish my introduction now. So I don't know which part it was cut off, but I, for deaf education, the project teams, and then also I have my own personal experience. I have a daughter who's on the autism spectrum, low vision, and I'm very passionate to design for different special groups of people to find a pathway. I found my pathway to becoming a licensed architect, and I want to provide strong representation for myself and also for various other clients.
This is Grace speaking. Thank you so much for everyone introducing themselves. Our next question is, from your perspective, which groups are most often overlooked in design and program creation, and why do you think this continues to happen?
I'm happy to start. This is Allison speaking. For me, I think a good standard is to say who has the least ability to self-determine their choice or path or their life in any given situation. And from where I sit in education, I would say children in foster care who have the least agency and are the most medicated group of Americans in the United States, and don't have the ability to self-determine where they are, what choices are made for them, and that also aligns with guardianship, those who are under guardianship and incarcerated. The school to prison pipeline is real. The amount of children with disabilities that are in foster care is 4 times that of the general population, and that is the same representation that of overrepresentation of those who are currently incarcerated. People with disabilities, that there are 4 times the amount of people with disabilities that are currently incarcerated than in the general population. And again, folks who are incarcerated have no rights. They have very little agency, even when they are released. And so those are fundamentally groups that I think are left out of design.
I can hop in here as well. This is Gia speaking. I mean, as I'm sure, Kevin, you could also speak to this as an architect, but something that I've definitely struggled with in my own practice, even as someone who is very conscientious of universal design and accessibility, is finding the best ways to create environments for people with multiple and or compounding conditions in terms of like, I think there's a lot of standards for people with sensory and physical disabilities. This is what you do for someone who's blind, someone who's a wheelchair user, but what about someone who's a blind wheelchair user? Like that is something that I don't feel like there's a ton of guidance on and something that is often forgotten. I mean, it's kind of just if, in any way, if you have multiple identities, it becomes much more difficult and much more complex in interacting with anything, much less the built environment. And so that is something, within my own practice, I have found to be a very difficult kind of aspect to best accurately design for. And I mean, in my own practice, I've just learned that the people who know what they want usually is the person with the disability. And so I would always just urge people to have, direct access and communication with the populations that they're designing for and giving them as much information as possible in terms so that they could make the decision on what would be the best for them.
Yeah. So, with building design, it has a purpose for its occupants, regardless of whether that is the general population or, students who have specific human abilities. And, that group, if that student, they're often overlooked. And it takes a lot of effort to work together and communicate on accessible design. Um, because it's not something as simple as lack of awareness. There may just not have been a lot of time invested, and there's that old saying, time is money. So when projects are expected to meet tight lines and tight budgets, um, tight timeframes, the design may only address minimum requirements for building and code. But, we all share that same desire to go beyond code requirements here.
This is Aja speaking. From my experience with ergonomics, I'm noticing that the aging or the geriatric population is kind of being left out of design. We see now that the age of retirement is going back further and further. And so technology is also evolutioning and keeping going further as well. And so we see that there are age-related changes that, regardless of who you are or what you identify or your diagnosis, you may experience, such as presbyopia. So you will lose your eyesight over time, or presbycusis, which is a loss of hearing, or even delays with your cognitive processing speeds. And so there are very tiny interfaces or low contrast with text or even doing a multi-step authentication, and everyone doesn't have a touchscreen cell phone. So the design isn't as intuitive. And so the geriatric population is moving a little bit slower to keep up with the pace of what's expected in the workforce now.
I love how you just talked about a barrier that the geriatric population can have, especially with technology. What are other barriers that exist for groups that are often forgot about and underrepresented?
I'm happy to start. This is Allison speaking. Can poverty just itself be a barrier? Um, I I can't tell. It's hard to explain for those who haven't maybe been unhoused before. I have, or a single parent before I have as well, or had transportation to, my car was repossessed, all of these different things, all come stemming from a disability discrimination lawsuit thing in the workplace. All I ever wanted to do was work. I'm such a good worker, but the workplace wasn't designed for everyone to thrive. And when I had nothing, the act of attempting to access anything was a barrier. Transportation, if one thing I ask folks to do is if you have your own transportation, you drive yourself, how long would it take you to get to your workplace using only public transportation? And if you have children, you have to take to work, or you have to take and drop off, those are even time. It costs disabled folks different. We use time differently, and poverty and disability, it overlaps so much that if you don't have money, that's the biggest barrier that you have, to access anything. You need money. And so I would say poverty is one of our biggest barriers, to access.
For me, this is Kevin speaking. The biggest barrier is communication. And not just communication, as it relates to ASL interpreters or live captioning, but also the translation, transliteration, and the broader challenge of communicating across different languages, cultures, and lived experiences. Also, there are people with neurodiversity who may not respond or organize their thoughts in a conventional way. And that might appear to others as disruptive to the process. When design teams or stakeholders are not willing to adapt to different communication modes or backgrounds, that means people are inevitably going to feel left out. For deaf people specifically, being the only one in a hearing environment can create barriers to what's called incidental learning that happens during side conversations. And maybe not getting to be a full participant could be misunderstood as disengagement or disinterest. And this type of misunderstanding over time can make it hard for any kind of group to be seen, heard, or represented well. And if design teams can understand and plan for communication access early and more often, then more people can stay engaged and feel included in conversation.
So with all the barriers mentioned, how can universal design and inclusive design address these concerns for underrepresentation?
This is Gia speaking. Something that I've actually noticed when we design things that are specifically for people with disabilities, labeled as such, geared towards people with disabilities, is that I think that the self-identification as a person with a disability or disabled person is maybe a little bit more complicated than some people might think. And so sometimes people who would definitely benefit from, say, like a bench or, something that isn't necessarily, like, oh, like this is a space that you can just move aside and, decompress if you're feeling overwhelmed. Like, people, sometimes if you label that as, this is a space for autistic people to come and take a rest, sometimes people who would definitely still need that, who don't self-identify as autistic or disabled, find it that they, oh, like this is not a space for me, when actually it's a space for everybody. So I just thought it was like I just wanted to bring it up as an interesting point of just like, universal design, designing for disability, designing for everything. It's for everybody. But even if you don't feel like you are someone with a disability, you can still use the spaces and the amenities that are for people with disabilities, in terms of like, if you need to take a rest, you should be able to take a rest, and you should be able to do that. Because I've just noticed that working with a lot of elderly folk, seniors, or people who, recently became disabled, it's very difficult for them to um, self-identify that way immediately. And so they might refuse to use spaces that are actually meant for them because of the way that they self-identify. And so I think maybe making universal design much more inclusive, much more natural, going above the bare minimum, would be something that would be super helpful for everybody, um, in terms of like being able to use and interact in spaces.
Hi, this is Aja speaking. Just to piggyback off of what Gia said, I do agree. Really shifting the design from designing for to designing with, because designing for is like a top-down approach, and designing with is collaboration. So talking to the members of the community, actively participating, getting feedback from the community, and accepting the feedback to make those changes. That way, we're incorporating the lived experiences, perspectives, and also voices of the unheard or those who may not be considered initially.
Well, those are both just brilliant observations, and similarly, leaning into even our disability rallying cry, nothing about us without us, is for us, is how that last piece ends. And we often leave that part off of our rallying cry, and that originates from South Africa. And it was a cross-racial disability justice movement that exploded in the 70s. There was a lot of that going on, and across the world. And it was people that were building relationship across differences, like Kevin was saying, that really drove that change. Nothing about us without us is for us. And they specifically meant the government and legislation and how we design our societies, our communities, and the rules in which we live by. What that disability justice movement taught us is that disabilities exist outside of white supremacy, and white supremacy is disabling. Both of those things are true, and it was this cross-racial disability justice movement that came together under apartheid that drove that change. And now we've got specific aid design that went into the redesign of their entire government in South Africa. That it's still obvious. There's still lots of growth and things happening. But one of the most important things that they did that I think that we should apply globally is it wasn't just about single disability issue. We don't have it. It's not just about how my autism interacts with the world. It's also about my narcolepsy and the fact that I could get startled and collapse at any time because of paralysis and cataplexy. If we are designing for who is least impacted and who might need to be engaged from the jump for a design, then by default we're building for everybody.
This is Kevin. Similarly to what was mentioned about the government and legislation, I hope we have better improve our representation. We have people there representing us more at a more senior level who have various backgrounds and disabilities, but we are not at their level. But the representation that our company recently represented and designed a new building at the Arkansas School for the Deaf and Blind in ARDB. It's a unique project and potentially the first of its kind because it brought deaf and blind students together in the same academic building. So representation had to be built into the process from the start. To help ensure both populations were represented well, the design team included architects with deaf and blind lived experiences. That kind of representation on both the design and the stakeholder sides helps to reduce the learning curves and better account for the cultural and for the sensory needs. In my view, involving the right subject matter experts early is a strong first step in addressing underrepresentation.
This is Grace speaking. I love the emphasis on including the design right before you even start it, just so no one's left out. And I want to ask if there's a real life example you guys have of a universal design feature, either in a building or in a product, that you can tell that universal design was thought of before it was like published.
I'll start. Allison speaking. I get really excited when I see water parks specifically for disability diverse communities that were built and that were built by families and children and people with such a diverse range of disabilities. And I've seen a couple, I can't remember the name of them specifically, but even Googling disability water park or disability friendly water parks is going to show you some options. And it's really the amount of spaces that we have where disabled people can play is, I mean, where do you see that very often? And so when we can just have something just for fun and joy and the pleasure of living life, then that to me is really excited. It's not just about how do we access services, right? How do we live our best lives?
This is Gia speaking. I just really wanted to maybe take this opportunity to shout out someone that I really admire and respect, Alexa Vaughn, who is a deaf landscape designer, and she's amazing. And her work in Deafscape, I think, has been incredibly informative and eye-opening. I think, to what Kevin has been saying, I think when you put people with disabilities, disabled people into spaces where they can design and create spaces, it makes it really apparent to the rest of the population that it actually benefits and works for every other person. So I think, I guess it's just a way to say like Deafscape and all of Alexa's work has been, it's based on her own personal experience as a deaf person. And so I just think, having greater representation, having more people who can, with lived experience in the driver's seat, just making these designs are basically the most powerful way in which we could create environments that work for everybody.
That is true. This is Kevin. When we did the planning on the ARDB project, what worked was we had a strong range of expertise on the design team. then using that expertise to guide us to structured engagement sessions with the stakeholders, with the deafblind students and the staff. Because it was just not a pre-K through 12 building, it also included a dining area, a student support service wing, and a public meeting space that doubled as a storm shelter. If we understand our user groups early by asking who they are, what they do, and why they're there, that can help shape each stakeholder session. Then, just as important, we return to those groups after their ideas have been incorporated so that they can see how their feedback influenced the design. Then we present engagement material matters just as much. For deaf participants, we try to be highly visual. We use hands-on plan layout and allow enough pause for people to move between the interpreter and the visuals. So, also, considering blind participants, we prepared embossed plan layouts and used more, it was very tactile, and used more descriptive verbal navigation related to the touch, the tactile. And both groups appreciated frequent design updates supported by a physical 3D model, which probably shortened the life of one of our 3D printers. That is what Nothing About Us Without Us looks like in our practice.
Can I add something? Kevin just prompted a thought. Thank you, Kevin. Is there are, I so appreciate when you're looking at the design of a space, of a building and and landscaping and that intentional design process, 1000% agree. And also, I was thinking of someone like my role where I might be brought in after the fact. And so how do we do after the fact planning? And I think that there is a way to do, it's not after the fact planning, but I'm thinking of, for example, I get brought in to be an accessibility consultant for a conference, a leadership conference. It's not the same kind of design process that that Kevin is referring to, but you can still you can apply that process to what we're doing. I might not be able to meet with people beforehand. That is why the relationships that I have in community on the day-to-day are crucially important. That we can't get what we need to have that kind of engagement and input and driving from the folks that are most impacted without the relationship behind it. That relationship building means that I can start to intuit when I have to plan and partner for spaces in an immediate kind of sense, or like an adaptable conference setting. And it reminded me, we had a survey that was sent out to this fellowship that had maybe had 100 people, and maybe 2 people said, I need accommodations. It was great. We made sure those accommodations were included, but because I take a whole person approach and a whole environment approach, there were cues everywhere, visual, there were tactile. We had what we called the quiet room with very explicit instructions for how it is to be used. And at the end of the conference, I got up on stage and I said, show of hands, how many people utilized or engaged with any of the accessibility features that we had in place? And I listed them off. Over 95% of the people in that room said they did. And that is why we say universal design is for everyone.
Yes, this is Aegis speaking. My example probably was about a week ago. I was in the airport and the flight that I was supposed to board on Thursday was canceled after about 3 hours of delay. And as you can imagine, everyone was in an uproar. But luckily, there were closed captions and subtitles of what the flight attendant was saying. And so I was able to get all the information, know that I needed to book another flight or find a hotel for the room. And that was just a universal benefit of accessibility being thought of within the design of the airport.
This is Kevin. I've had the same experience with the airport in Dallas, and it's easy to tell the old terminal from the new terminal because the old one is in a very tight space, obviously designed before the time of TSA and embedding of insecurity. They had long curved halls, and it was almost like a carousel. And you never know when barriers would pop up along the way. In the new terminal, the C terminal, you can see the renovation was expanded and they replaced the curved hallways with hallways that had gradual turns in them. And so that gave you more line of sight. It lessened the anxiety about barriers. So that was an adaptation. The wayfinding improved because of the colors, the textures, on the walkways and at the gates, and even on the ceilings. It was recognizable, easy to see, the numbers, the specific information, and also the names of the airlines, their pictures that also helped with wayfinding. For example, there was less people that were like flying from the airport that were overwhelmed. So the airport itself was less overwhelming.
I always get so excited when the real world examples, you can see the universal design and how it really is helping people in their day-to-day life. Um, that's all we have time for our panel. Thank you so much for all your guys' time and your expertise. And we're now ready for some questions from our audience. Rachel, what questions does our audience have for our panelists today?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Grace. I want to start by just thanking everybody for being so patient as we go back and forth with our Zoom technology and make sure that everybody can see our interpreters and Kevin as well. We appreciated your notes and your help getting this right. Thank you so much. And while we're on the topic of technology, that was one of the questions we had come in when folks signed up. We asked everyone who signed up if they had any questions for us, and there is a great question asking about how modern technology can be used to make the world a more inclusive place. And they were hoping for some examples or our expert panelists' thoughts on the use of technology to make spaces more inclusive.
This is Kevin speaking. Hello. So, my response to that, I'll try to keep it brief here, is that technology is great. They've been improving a lot of things, especially since 2020 during COVID, during the epidemic. Things really shifted to online. And I think that really helped us improve certain things about technology as it relates to captions and Zoom and Teams meetings. And I think at that time, things had started to like things were behind before, and now things have started to improve, especially like for deaf people using interpreters. Video technology has been shifting to, we've been more dependent on video. Um, Deaf people use, VRI. And, just like an hour ago, my technology, I had an issue where my computer lapsed. So there are still things that need to be improved. But one example of how technology has improved and been able to help, um, but, we just can't always become overly dependent on it.
This is Allison. I can go. Um, so I think that technology and even assistive technology has specifically gone a long way. And I think the most impactful assistive technology is really driven by disabled people at in the design process in general. Um, I will also say that was probably the core reason that I experienced disability discrimination in the workplace was because of I'm someone that needs to work remotely or from home. Um, this was well before the pandemic, and that is what was taken away from me was my accommodations to work remotely and have a flexible start and end time. My accommodations are actually pretty minimal and free. Um, I lost jobs because of we can't do that virtually. We don't have the technology for that. Um, and that's just not the case anymore. And now that we've seen how possible it is to work remotely, we saw an increase in the employment of disabled people across the nation. Because all of a sudden it turns out we can build accessible systems. Now, did they all work? I mean, there's issues. We all navigate those, but it became more accessible to even work. If we think about the workplace as somewhere that it can be your home, but it can also be a physical location. And so what do we mean by space? And as a founder of a business, there are things that I can do now as a disabled business owner that I wasn't able to do 2 years ago because of technological advances that just help.
This is Asia speaking. So in ergonomics, we say to design for the weakest and for the smallest, because if you do that, then everybody is able to use it. And so looking at it from a technology standpoint, keeping it simple and intuitive. So um, universally, we kind of know green for a good thing or go, or red for stop wrong. We know an X for something wrong, a check mark for something being right. So keeping the design intuitive so that most are able to use it regardless of their cognitive function or their physical functions.
This is Gia speaking. So coming from the Bay Area where there's just, a bunch of tech startups, a bunch of things happening, I think it's really important that technology is created to serve what people actually want to do every day in terms of making a mouth guard remote control for your computer so that you don't have to use your hands to use your computer and stuff like that. Those are all things that I've seen around, being developed at different startups. And I just think, it's really interesting because I think there is a lot of technology and there's a lot of burgeoning technology. Um, I think there's also a lot of complications with how fast we can catch up with technology. I think using it to address actual need and actual use is really important instead of just solving issues that are not really issues, I think. I feel like some assistive technologies were created without actually asking disabled people what they want. And so, it's like it's like a perceived issue that is not a real issue. So I think as long as I think technology is super helpful and amazing and helping life become way more convenient. But I think it's also still needs to be based in engagement, still needs to be based in community. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists, for those wonderful answers and just your time here today. I've had a wonderful time, and I know our audience has as well. And I think it's safe to say that we have all learned so much. And I hate to start taking us to the conclusion because I know that there's still so much to be said, but we're getting to be about that time. So with that, we've reached the end of today's webinar. We do want to hear from you about what you thought and what can be improved, what was good, what you liked, and what we can continue to work on. So we do have a link that we're going to be including in the chat for your responses and for your expert feedback. On behalf of our entire team, I want to extend a very heartfelt thank you to each of our speakers again. Thank you, Allison, Gia, Asia, and Kevin, for sharing your knowledge, your passion, your perspective. And thank you all for being here. Your participation and you joining us, engaging in the chat, and making this conversation meaningful is really, I think, one of the key next steps to making change. And we hope you're walking away today with not only new insights, but also new ideas on how to ensure that your work and your world is an inclusive one. We do have one more Universal Design webinar that will be happening in September, so please stay tuned for an announcement about that. We are also going to have our Universal Design Summit 8 in November, from November 18th to November 20th. It will be taking place in St. Louis, Missouri in person, but we will also have a digital component and a digital option for folks. So this will be a hybrid conference. We're going to have presenters and attendees from across the country with networking opportunities, continuing education units available, universal design tours, and so much more. You're not going to want to miss it. To make sure you stay in the loop, please take a moment to sign up for our mailing list. We'll have Katie drop that link in the chat for us momentarily. So we hope to see you as part of that and to have you continue to be in contact with us. Once we get the captions from today's event cleaned up, we're going to be sending out the recording of the webinar, as well as a few bonus resources and links for all of you. If you found value in this session, we encourage you to share today's recording once we have it available and send it out to your network, because the more people who are part of this conversation, the greater the impact we can create. Thank you again for being here and for the work you're doing in your own life to create a more inclusive future. We look forward to being in touch again soon. And in the meantime, take care, stay curious, and we hope to have your participation in our programming once again. Thank you, everyone.